Hello and welcome back to Spy Hard's podcast. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur. And Scott, when you hear the beep, tell me everything.
I was waiting for the beep.
Beep.
Well, I'll tell you everything. We're back with our extended coverage of 2003's The Recruit, the Al Pacino, Colin Farrell spy movie we spoke about a couple of days ago. But we have a very special guest joining us this week.
That's right, we do. We are talking to director Roger Donaldson, who helmed not just The Recruit, but also No Way Out, which we covered on the show, and The November Man with Pierce Brosnan, which we will cover on the show at some point in the far-off future or near future. We don't know yet.
It's all very up in the air. But yeah, this guy's also responsible for a lot of your favorite films: Dante's Peak, Species, even Cocktail. He's the man behind them all. It's not often we get to talk to someone who's done several spy movies. Like we'll speak to like Jeremiah Chechik, who made The Avengers, or that sort of thing. But to have a bona fide Hollywood director with a ton of clout and a lot of hits in his filmography, it's quite an honor. So I think without further ado, Cam, roll that interview. And joining us now on the show, the director of some of your favorite films and some of our favorite spy films, it is Mr. Roger Donaldson. Hello, sir. How are you doing?
I'm very good.
Thank you for coming on the show. We've spoken about a couple of your spy movies already on the show. And we're eager to sort of take them apart and talk about them all with you, because you've got some very different spy entries when you look at the complete works there.
Yeah.
But I think maybe before we get to the films themselves, let's just talk a little bit about you and just what made you want to get into directing and filmmaking in the first place.
It's
the $1 billion question.
I went to college and I was going to be a geologist.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized after working out in the wilds of Australia that geology really was a pretty lonely life for a single young man. And my real passion was photography. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I finished up moving from Australia to New Zealand. I became a photographer, and that quickly morphed into shooting commercials and documentaries, and that morphed into ultimately directing movies.
Okay.
Producing, writing them, and whatever it took to make them.
And I mean, was film something you were interested in from an early age? Were you sort of fascinated by films, or was it more just the photography led you into it?
Well, Australia was not, back in the early 60s, was not exactly the centre of filmmaking in the world. And my dad's passion was American movies, and we'd do things like go to the drive-in movie on a Wednesday night and see a double feature of Eddie Murphy's To Hell and Back and stuff like that. And then my mum was a bit more. Her mother was English and sort of had come from London and was a bit more demanding of the intellectual side of life, I guess you'd say. And she liked to go and see foreign movies like those early Bergman movies, and we would go down to Melbourne often from the town that I lived in. And, go and see some more exotic fare. So between the two of them, became a passion for movies and all sorts of movies, really.
And was there a particular style of film, a director perhaps that caught your eye at a young age, something for you to sort of look towards?
I do remember those early Bergman movies. They were so graphic in their black and white sort of, they were very, they stuck with me. I mean, those images still stick, still with me.
Well, I think what we'll do in terms of looking at the spy films, we'll try and go in a timeline. So we'll start with your first film, which is one of our favorites, which is No Way Out.
Right. It wasn't so long ago. I actually watched it again this morning.
Oh, nice.
Oh, wow.
And so it's fresh in my mind. And I have to confess, it's not a bad movie.
No, not at all. In fact, we talked to Ross and Marshall Thurber, who directed the movie Red Notice, for example, and he cited this as his favorite spy movie of all time.
Well, it's got a great plot, and people like, Kevin and Gene Hackman and Sean Young, they all did a great job. Will Patton.
Absolutely. So I suppose the first question is always, when it comes to looking at these films, and you've done a couple of films by this point already, what made you interested in doing a spy movie, and what got you connected to the film?
Well, I came to Hollywood and I did The Bounty, and then what was the next thing I did was Marie, which was a sort of, a story of spying, not really, but a thriller.
Mm-hmm.
with Sissy Spacek and Morgan Freeman and people like that. And then I think this was the third movie I did. So I mean, I like the script. I like the people that were making it. Ryan Pictures I've been involved with before on The Bounty. So there were lots of reasons why I wanted to do it, and I thought that Kevin was going to be a fast up and coming actor, and I thought that Gene Hackman was as good as they come. So there was a lot going for him.
Yeah, because this is like right at that point where Kevin Costner is about to explode. Like, was there a real sense of that when you were signing on to do it?
Well, as a filmmaker, you always try and be one step ahead of the curve, as it were. And Kevin was I mean, it was probably Laura Ziskin, if I can remember correctly, that it was her idea that Kevin was an up and coming star, and I didn't take much convincing. I liked his work. I saw what was it called? Was it Fandango or something like that?
Silverado?
No, it was like a road movie where somebody pulls the front of a Cadillac. I think it's called Fandango.
Right.
Anyway, that movie I saw him in it, and he was great. And I was like, I didn't need any more convincing. I thought he had a lot of potential, and he did more than I even anticipated.
Yeah, no kidding. And I mean, he's obviously, this is like his first like major leading role. He was doing The Untouchables, right, I believe, around the same time. But like, you would work with him later on like 13 Days, where he's like at that point, really gone through the course of being a movie star. But at this point, what is it like working with this sort of up and coming star?
Well, to be honest, he was the same, first and second times I worked with him. He was a very determined, talented, ambitious young guy who had a lot of, good ideas, really great ideas about how to make a film. And, filmmaking is a very collaborative exercise anyway. So, Kevin and I got on well.
Well, you mentioned that you actually went back and watched it this morning. And I actually watched it again the other day as well. So just for yourself, looking back on the project itself, is there something that jumped out to you, like a performance that really jumped out to you, apart from Costner?
Well, I think I was, after having made so many movies since then, you get a very critical eye, and I just think the performances are really fantastic. I mean, just Gene Hackman's exceptional. That the way he manages to get the sort of humor into the darkest of moments. I mean, Kevin's, great looks, his fabulous eyes. I mean, there was so much about him that I didn't really sort of remember about until I saw this film again.
One of the really genius aspects of this movie is the way it pulls out the rug of the audience, where you think you're getting something of a, romantic drama perhaps, and then they pull the rug out from under you and it turns into a procedural. And one of the things I really noted on my rewatch last night was basically the love story aspect ties up about 43 minutes. And in that first 43 minutes, there's a lot going on in terms of table setting, character introductions. I would love to know just from you about getting the audience invested in that relationship in such a short amount of time and how you pull that off.
Well, I think, there was real chemistry between the two of them. And I think Sean Young, had an incredible sort of personality that comes across on the character. She's quirky, she's gorgeous, she's sexy, she's intelligent, she's a great talent. She had a lot going for her. And I think the chemistry between her and Kevin, while I wouldn't say they ever became friends or anything, they definitely had a chemistry on screen.
Mm-hmm. And it feels like there was a bit of improv, because is it correct? Like the scene where they are driving and he's, quote unquote, eating the bugs off the windshield. Like that was him improving, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And stuff like even the stuff in the limousine, they never, I think the original script didn't have a limousine scene in it. And I went to Washington looking for locations, and they sent this big stretch limo to pick me up. And, being as an Aussie and feeling a little bit uncomfortable in the back of a limousine, I said, okay to the driver if I ride up front with him. So I'm riding up front with the driver, and I say to him, tell us, anybody ever get up to mischief in the back of your limousine? And he goes, oh, and he starts to tell me the story about how he gets the mirror organized and carries on. And anyway, that's sort of that was the beginning of the origins of that part of the script. And in the movie, I tracked down the same guy that told me the story, and that's him driving the limo.
There you go. One thing I wanted to ask is about the big twist at the end. Don't worry, everyone's listening to this has seen the film. They know the big spoiler. But it's not in the original book. It's an addition for the film, which is I think it works. One thing I like about it though is that you do sprinkle those breadcrumbs throughout.
Can I just say something before we go
Sure.
further? I've never read the book Big Clock or seen the movie, so I don't know anything about the origins of this plot other than.
Sure, that's fine. No,
Yeah.
no. That's fine. I mean, I haven't read either, to be fair.
Okay.
But don't worry, you're in good company.
I just didn't want to say, how I was influenced or in any way. I didn't even know about the origins of the Big Clock until after I'd actually shot the movie.
No, for sure. I didn't. I suppose just from doing research. But what I liked though was the sprinkling of clues that if you go back and rewatch it,
Yeah.
it is there. Like he's drinking Stolichnaya, I think the Russian vodka and stuff like that. Was that stuff that was in the script, or was that things that just came up on set about you leaving some clues in for the viewer?
No, they were in the script. They were in the script. I mean, this is my memory of it. I mean, it's a long time ago now. My memory is though that those plot points were in the original script. They weren't sort of thought up as we went along.
Well, it definitely works. Is there a trick for adding these clues in without making them too like over the top on screen?
Well, I mean, the challenge, of course, was to not give away the end of the movie without, and yet keep the have an integrity to the story, so that if you did watch it twice, you go like, oh my god, yeah, why didn't I pick up on that?
And I was really curious to know about the performance of Will Patton, which I think is absolutely incredible. Because, the way the movie's set up, you would think like Gene Hackman is going to be the antagonist, but you really get the sense at a certain point that Will Patton assumes that role. And I would love to know just about the decision to cast him and then, helping direct him to this just unbelievable performance.
Well, the casting, I didn't start with the casting, I think it was. Anyway, the casting person told me about this great actor who was on a play, was performing on a play in New York on Broadway. And so she organised some seats for me to go and see, Will doing this play. And I was like right there in the front row, and I was, exhausted. I was, anyway, I fell asleep during the play. And I wake up and I see, Will up there, and I was like, holy shit, and Will's looking straight at me. I was like, I had no options. He had to get the part. No, I mean, he was a fantastic choice, and he was a fantastic talent, and I've had him, and he did a piece in another movie of mine as well.
Right. And I was really interested to know, I mean, in this movie, you kind of have two ticking clocks going on. You've got the photo that's slowly being developed, as well as the gift list, as we are waiting to find out if they can connect, Gene Hackman's character to the crime. And I would just love to know about working with the editors to make that all work, because you've got two ticking clocks, you've got all these, little diversions involving action scenes and all that sort of thing. How do you essentially get this across in a way where the audience isn't going to get lost?
Well, you obviously got to sort of plot out exactly where you're going with it and not sort of lose the pace of the piece and not be sort of repetitive or whatever. But I did have a really great editor, Neil Travis, who unfortunately is no longer with us. But Neil was a great editor, and I know, I think after he edited No Way Out, he did Dances with Wolves for Kevin. And, a great editor can have a big impact on how a picture comes together, and Neil was really as good as they come.
Well, I suppose then, I mean, I'm more or less out of questions for No Way Out, but now that you've gone back and revisited the film, looking at it as part of your spy works, is there anything you'd go back and change about the film now? Or are you happy with it as a piece of work?
No, I mean, you see a film again after so much time, and you go like, could I have shortened it or made it tighter or anything? And maybe there's a sequence, a storm sequence where Kevin rescues somebody on the deck of a ship that if I was cutting it again, I could probably cut it a bit tighter. But the rest of it really hung together really well for me.
No, and you struck gold with Costner. That was the exact moment for Kevin Costner. It was perfect casting.
And it was one of Gene's better movies too, I think.
For sure, yeah.
He had a lot of great movies in his repertoire.
When I saw the ending of the movie last night, it reminded me a lot of the ending of 3 Days of the Condor, of sort of the guy who's going to be left essentially in the cold. Was that any influence, or is that just...
Yeah, I mean, listen, unfortunately, the writer is no longer with us as well. Robert Garland. I mean, I'm sure Bob was aware of, other movies that had those sort of, types of endings.
Mm-hmm.
As a filmmaker, you're always trying to throw twists on twists, and the audience. And with thrillers, I mean, the challenge of making a good thriller is to keep challenging the audience so they think they know who, because there's only so many people in the story that can be the goodie and the baddie. And so the challenge of making a good thriller is to confuse the audience and have them thinking A is going to happen when B is going to happen, so that they keep being surprised and involved and intrigued by the story. So that's the challenge always, I think, of making a thriller, is trying to make it less than predictable and keep surprising the audience, so they feel invested in trying to catch up with you as a filmmaker.
Have you gotten a sense just over the years of the legacy of No Way Out?
Well, only that I keep being asked by lots of producers, you got another story like No Way Out? Oh, we've tried to do a No Way Out story. I mean, obviously people are developing plot lines of No Way Out has been mentioned lots of times in the sort of story rooms where people are trying to put together thrillers.
Well, I want to move into The Recruit, which is another very notable spy movie. And it's interesting that you have, Kevin Costner in No Way Out, primed to explode. And with The Recruit, you have Colin Farrell, who is in that huge boom early in his career where he was working constantly. I would love to know, just, again, you're working with like an up-and-coming superstar, one of the best actors of his generation. What was it like working with Colin right out of the gate there?
Well, I mean, Colin was, obviously just an incredible talent and energetic and enthusiastic. And he was sort of like, Kevin wasn't when I worked with him the first time. He was full of just enthusiasm and energy, and, he was just a joy to work with. And he was a great, Al Pacino, the two of them sort of fight off each other in a similar way to what Hackman and Kevin did. One was the old, the experienced actor with an incredible history and repertoire, and the other one was the young new kid on the block. And I think they both, both lots of guys sort of fight off each other.
Yeah, because it's like Colin Farrell up and coming, and then Al Pacino, who's like at pure icon status at this point. And like, I would just love to know about, like finding the chemistry between the two of them. And you said like it was a real like back and forth that worked.
Well, I think, Colin has got a chemistry of his own. Everything he does has got a sort of a twinkle in his eye, and he's a completely irreverent sort of character in real life. The crew loved him, the other actors loved him. I loved him. He would do anything to do it better, and that he was never took it too seriously, where he sort of became a pain in the ass.
And now with The Recruit, I believe it was James Foley was attached to direct this one, and then you came in and directed. I'm curious, where in the process did you come into the movie? Was it like locked down at that point, or was there time to develop it?
I honestly don't know. I know James Foley was involved with it before I was, but I don't know the transition.
Right.
I just remember being offered this movie to make, and there was obviously a lot of work got done on the script after I came on board.
Okay.
So I don't really have any knowledge of the history before I was part of it.
Well, you were talking about the connection between Colin Farrell and Al Pacino and getting involved past the original director. Was the cast already set by that point, or did you still have a hand in casting the roles?
No, to be honest, I do not remember. I suspect, I don't think Al was involved with it. I think Colin maybe was.
Right.
But I'd be lying. I can't remember. No, Al must have not been involved, because I remember going to New York and meeting with him and talking to him about the script. So obviously it was about getting him involved in being in it. So I don't think he was involved prior to me being involved.
Okay. And did you had you had any sort of relationship with Al Pacino before getting him into the movie?
No, only that we knew each other, just through sort of Hollywood, and knew each other.
Right.
I tried to get him in the movie I did earlier. I did a movie called Cadillac Man, and I had ambitions for getting Al involved, but he felt it was too much like some other work he'd done, so that didn't happen. But I remember meeting with him about that.
And when it came to creating the world of The Recruit, I think the farm material is very strong in this movie, and I would love to know sort of finding the line between research and invention in creating these set pieces.
I know there was I should have watched this film too. I don't know if he's a producer or a writer, but he was connected to the CIA and had he took me to the CIA and showed me around there. So he obviously, this character, Chase Brandon.
Yeah, Brandon. Yeah.
He knew, he was. I mean, when he showed up there, I mean, he was like, Roger, if you want me to show you around, I'll show you around. And I was like, full of, you meet lots of characters in Hollywood that say they know more and can get you into places that they can't. But anyway, I showed up at the CIA with Chase, and Chase, everybody was like, "Hi, Chase, good to see you," at the front gate. And obviously, I mean, I didn't see much more than the front entrance way and some corridors, but he obviously knew his way around the place, and they knew him. And so, the sort of the story of the farm was sold to me as though there was an element of truth to the sort of stories that were in the movie.
Well, one thing it's worth pointing out between sort of No Way Out and The Recruit is you've done a bunch of different films in between that, Cocktail, Species, Dante's Peak, which I'm going to get to in a minute. But just between those two spy films, they're very different films. What's the challenge like in moving from something like No Way Out to this? Is it harder film to direct or easier in some ways?
Well, no, I think the challenge for me is always to find something different that's not a repeat of the last thing I've just done. I mean, the next movie I made after No Way Out was Cocktail. And, very different sort of movies with different sort of expectations and different audience. I'm always looking for something that's a bit of a challenge and not going down the same road. You don't want your life to be Groundhog Day, but same story again and again and again.
Definitely. And do you think No Way Out helped get you the job on The Recruit? Like, was that something that would have helped, or completely irrelevant to getting you The Recruit?
Well, I think what helped. What got me the job, I guess, was I had a track record of making films that got released and came out well, and the audience liked them, and they made some money. And obviously, No Way Out was a movie that was it was a bit of a sleeper at the time, and sort of came up strong, and so it's a movie that people still talk about.
Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of twists and turns throughout The Recruit, and I would like to know about, you talked about like planning with No Way Out, but did this movie feel more complicated because not only are you trying to get the audience through from a plot perspective, but also the central romantic relationship is also very twists and turns throughout. So I'd like to know just how difficult it was to kind of track that beginning to end.
Well, I think, Mitch Glaser, the writer, was, on set, at least at the beginning of the shoot, I remember. And, it's the pleasure of making these sort of films is to get the twists and turns and trying to keep one step ahead of the audience and keep surprising the audience and keep them involved and, just keep putting twists and turns in it. And
one of the notes I had about The Recruit when I was watching it that jumped out was there's a part where there's a very specific James Bond reference, and I've seen interviews that you at certain points had been having conversations with Eon about James Bond. I was just curious, from what I'd seen, you weren't sure what movie it was. Do you remember what kind of era that was?
No, I don't.
No? Okay.
Oh yeah, well, fair enough. No, it's hard to remember. I imagine everyone was approached in some way or form over the years from Eon because they're always looking for the top directors. Especially if you look at the 90s, around Dante's Peak sort of time, you're working with Brosnan.
Yeah, no, I remember talking to the the Broccolis about a Bond. Is this what you're talking about?
Yeah.
But my memory of it is that we couldn't come anywhere near close to a deal, and so it never went anywhere.
No, it's fair enough. I wanted to talk about the next spy film, which is The November Man.
Right.
But I don't feel like we can talk about that properly without mentioning Dante's Peak first, because I feel like one feeds into the other. And I really want to pick the brain of a man who dropped a rock through someone's head in a car and put an old lady in an acid lake, because it's a fascinating film to talk about. This was my introduction to you. The first film of yours I ever saw. It must have been on home video, I think. I don't think I saw it in theaters. But I went back to it the other day, and I I did not remember any of the stuff with like the rock or the lady
Yeah.
in the lake, and I'm just amazed that got through at a PG-13.
No, well, in fact, my kids, as children, couldn't bear to watch it. It was just too terrifying.
Yeah, it's truly terrifying.
So get some of that stuff and be like, don't make us watch this. It's too scary.
But I want to watch it again.
I started off life, I was going to be a geologist, and I had a real passion about geology. I mean, the subject of geology, and living in New Zealand where there are lots of volcanoes, and knowing quite a bit about volcanoes just from my studies as a young student. So I was attracted to the project by its sort of scientific basis, I guess.
Well, with the geology background, I was reading about this before. It's like the perfect film for you. It's like your interests, and also it's going to be a big budget film. Like this is the zenith for you, really.
So it was challenging. It's challenging to make a sort of family film because it's a sort of thankless task a bit because you're trying to make they save the dog and make sure the kids don't get killed. But it was also incredibly rewarding in that being able to make stuff on this enormous scale and do some of the things that we did in that film. As a filmmaker, it really was a super, super big challenge to make it. And of course, there were no digital effects in those days. I mean, I think there's one sequence I think that has some digital lava in it. But most of it, all the stuff where they're driving through the lava and all that's all real. It was there on screen looking exactly like it was.
One thing that blew me away just doing my research, and I watched some behind the scenes videos, especially with like the car and the bridge being washed away, all done by miniature, which I didn't know. Yeah.
No, I know. It looks very convincing when you're watching it on the big screen.
Absolutely. But what was it like working with sort of scale miniatures and sort of getting that action, still keeping it believable at the same time?
Well, I think that was the challenge. I mean, there was one enormous challenge that I didn't wish I had, which was that there was another movie called Volcano being made by Fox at the same time that was, breathing down my neck, and I had to get my film done before that came out because I wasn't going to be second for anybody. So at one stage there, towards the end of that production, I had 6 film crews shooting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I was literally living in the back of a Lincoln Town car and going from set to studio to get it done on time with a room full of editors, and it was pretty crazy there at the end. But it was, some of that miniature stuff was on an epic scale, and I had some really great people involved. Dennis Washington, who'd been the production designer on No Way Out, that's where I met him. He was the production designer of it. There was just lots of things that happened on that film. Like I remember when the town fell down, we had, I think, the most cameras that Panavision had ever rented to one show at the same time. It was over 20 cameras rolling on one shot, basically. It was epic filmmaking like I've never seen since.
Were you a fan of like those 70s disaster movies like, Earthquake or Towering Inferno?
Well, no, not really. I mean, I guess more intimate, stories of my own personal taste. Movies like My Life as a Dog.
Well, you say about like sleeping in your car and all these sets running at the same time, and yet you beat Volcano to the big screen, and
we did.
Yeah, too right. And
I wasn't going to fucking come second after doing all that much work.
But that's the thing. Like you hear of films that they rush their production, and you get a subpar film. You cannot see the seams in this film. It is one of the best disaster flicks I think has ever been created, and you did it quicker than you were supposed to do, and without sleeping, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I had some fantastic help. First of all, the cast were fantastic, but I had a fantastic crew. Andre Barkoviak was the DP. Dennis Washington was the production designer. I mean, those two people, they just had such an enormous influence on how the movie came together. Their enthusiasm and their help and their talents. They both took an enormous load off me. So it was always, I never felt like I was trying to carry the stone up the hill on my own.
No, for sure. Now, one question I had about Dante's Peak, and you mentioned the geology of it all in your background. Was there ever an issue of trying to separate the actual science from what is a disaster flick, or is it actually quite factual when you boil it down to the science?
Well, it is quite factual. I mean, one of the first things I did was, rent a helicopter and fly into Mount St. Helens and look at the scale of what had happened with Mount St. Helens. And I thought I had a clue what it was like before I went there, but to see it firsthand, to fly into the crater of Mount St. Helens and then to see just thousands of acres of trees just laid, giant redwoods just ripped out of the ground, lakes covered in logs still 20 years later. I mean, it was the scale of what happened in Mount St. Helens just made me realize what the potential of the film was.
No, for sure. And I think you capture it well. Now, one of the main reasons I brought this film up, and I'm sure you'll know, is because of its leading man, Mr. Pierce Brosnan.
Yeah.
Now, what was the casting like for the film? Did you have your eye on Brosnan?
Well, Pierce and I actually knew each other. We knew each other through Brian Brown.
Right.
Who was also my Brian Brown, who was in Cocktail. And so I sort of was friends with Pierce before we worked together.
Okay. So did you just have him in mind for the script and he read for the role and that was it?
I don't remember how the transition came from him being in the film, but we were friends before we worked together.
Okay.
And we're still friends.
No, I was just reading an interview with him the other day recently. You mentioned your name, so that was works out well. But okay, so you knew him already, and so there we go, he works to the role. But what was it like just having him on set? Because he'd just come off of GoldenEye,
right.
And I think immediately after shooting this, he goes to shoot the next Bond film, Tomorrow Never Dies.
Right.
This is again Brosnan at the sort of height of his power. You just had Costner before as well. What was it like working with him on set?
Well, we were working up in Idaho, and we just had a fucking good time. We enjoyed ourselves working. We enjoyed ourselves on the weekends when we had time off. And it was, I think, making that film was one of the more enjoyable experiences of my whole Hollywood career.
I'm curious because one thing I really noticed over the course of your career is you worked with a lot of the big movie stars of that time. What do you get working with like some of these big iconic movie stars that you don't necessarily get on other films?
Well, I think, if you can get movie stars in your movies, people, the audience and the critics and the money all take the project more seriously. I mean, I think that's what, it's not like there are no good actors out there unless you get a superstar, but it does like when I was making The World's Fastest Indian, to get Tony Hopkins on to say he'd been in the film made that film happen. Without Tony, I wouldn't have had a shit show getting that film off the ground.
I don't think I can let Dante's Peak go past without mentioning Linda Hamilton as well, which I think she does a fantastic job of.
No, she was such a sweetie. I mean, she really is.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think you sort of know how people are when you work with them. I never once remember her doing anything other than being completely, help the kids get through the day. Make sure she couldn't do enough for the movie or for the other characters in the film or the story or. She just really was just a sweetie to work with.
Well, before we drift on over to The November Man, and you said it's one of the best experiences you had making a film in your career. Just looking back on the film now, either it could be a scene from the finished project or a scene or a moment from when you were shooting it. What's your fondest memory of the film?
Of Dante's Peak?
Yeah.
There was a day that... well, it's not the fondest memory, but it's the strongest memory I had.
Sure.
We had this whole town rigged. Dennis Washington had built the whole town so that it was built around this town of Wallace, Idaho. And it was a town that was half sort of derelict, half it was there and half wasn't. So wherever there were buildings missing, he filled in with sets. And then the whole town was going to there was going to be one take as Pierce was going to drive the vehicle through the town, and the town was going to fall down around it from the earthquakes. And the whole, we had 20 cameras all lined up, ready to roll. We had, 20 film crews. We had Pierce, in the car and Linda, ready to roll. And we had the special effects guy who was going around and checking all of the, explosives to make sure that everything was timed to come down. And I'm there ready, and everything's ready to go, but we're just doing the last minute checks on everything. And I look across and I see the special effects guy with 2 wires, and I put them onto the battery that makes all the explosives go up. And I see him go touch the wires. I still remember the sparks as the whole town starts to blow up, and nobody said roll the cameras or anything. Every camera crew assumed that they hadn't heard roll cameras or action. Pierce assumed he hadn't heard action, and everybody rolled their cameras, and Pierce took off and was trying to catch up to what was happening, and that we got the shot.
Oh, that was a shot.
That was it. There was never roll the camera action.
Oh man.
There a sequence in a Peter Sellers movie or something like that. Producers or something. There's a sequence where a special effects guy blows up a bridge and they're not ready when you or something.
Well, you pulled it off. I am glad I revisited it for this. It's still up there with one of my favorite '90s films. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Well, thanks.
But let's drift on over to your other Pierce Brosnan film, which also has more connections like Will Patton, which is The November Man.
Right.
So what brought you now? I've seen different bits of information about this, so maybe you can clarify if you can recall.
Yeah.
I know Pierce Brosnan and his production company Irish Dreamtime had the rights to the story.
Right. He was involved as a producer with Beau Marie St. Clair.
That's right. Yeah.
Beau Marie was a big good. I mean, we knew each other socially. Beau Marie and Lloyd Phillips were like really, really great friends of mine. Unfortunately, both have passed away now. But it was their idea to get me involved.
Okay, that was the question, basically. Yeah, so they brought you in, basically.
Shriram Das, the Indian film producer too. He was part of the equation as well.
Okay, and at that point, was Pierce cast as the lead? Because I've heard mixed stories on who was the lead.
No, I only ever knew of the lead was him.
Okay. I can refute the information on IMDb then, because it was never going to be. I'd heard it was Daniel Craig for a little while.
No, never. They may have tried to get Daniel, but it was before I was ever involved.
Okay, that makes sense. But this is a return to the spy world for you after The Recruit, and a return to the spy world for Pierce Brosnan after Die Another Day. Well, at least for Bond anyway. But was there a sense of trepidation from him trying to get back into that role, or was he gung ho?
I think he was gung ho. It was originally the film was, I think, set in Berlin.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Germany was just impossible financially to make it happen there, and the idea of moving to Serbia appealed to me because Serbia felt like it was off the beaten track a bit, and the sort of history of Serbia and recent history of Serbia seemed to make it challenging to want to make a film there. So we rewrote the script. I mean, a big rewrite to make it Serbia and not Germany. And that's how it came to be Serbia.
Well, it certainly gives it that European feel that I think works as well. That does work for the film. The other thing I find interesting about casting is, firstly, you've got Will Patton coming back after No Way Out. So was that like a little nod to your previous spy work by having him come back?
I just you work with great actors and you're always looking for a place to bring them back if you can.
No, it makes sense to me. And he's great in both films and many others. Well, the other one was Olga Kurylenko, who had previously starred in Quantum of Solace. So we have another Bond connection there.
Right,
but what was like casting her in the role? Because I think she's terrific in this film.
Yeah, no, she's a real talent. I mean, I don't remember. I mean, obviously, Pierce knew her.
Mm.
I mean, she wouldn't. I mean, no casting ever comes like, this is who's going to be in your film. It's like, what about Olga? I think maybe we could get her to be interested in. She was. I mean, she's a fantastic talent.
No, well, it totally works. But so I guess then my first question about just making this film is, what was it like to work with Pierce again?
Well, once again, Pierce and I are friends, and so it was great on the weekends as well as when we were shooting. I mean, Pierce unfortunately was going through a personal family tragedy in the middle of it all. His stepdaughter died, so that was challenging for Pierce. And then if it's challenging for the lead actor, it's obviously comes down to the other people. And it was a limited budget film that didn't have any wiggle room in terms of schedule or anything. So it was we had to work hard.
No, I still, it's a very successful film. And I think one thing it does really well is and actually something calls back to No Way Out in a way. You manage to weave several twists in it without it feeling like it's overburdening the audience, which a lot of spy films can do. They get very twisty for the sake of being twisty.
Yeah.
But this film nails the landing, in my opinion.
Good.
And what's it like just juggling that sort of the different plots? Because obviously you've got Olga's character turns out to be the person they're looking for later on in the film. And sort of and dealing with those plot points and making it work.
Well, I guess that's the fun of making those sort of films, and that's what if I've got a talent, it's keeping those suspense balls in the air and not getting confused myself about what story I'm trying to tell.
No, for sure. And is there? I mean, this is your most recent of the spy films you've done. Is there a moment or a scene particularly that stands out to you? Something you're quite proud of?
Oh God, what is it? I think the scene where Pierce cuts her leg, because it was a very sort of it was a tough scene to sort of make work. It required obviously some great acting from from everybody. There was that potential that the Pierce character doing this would lose sympathy and interest in him as a character. So it was a challenging scene to do, and I think it works. I think it's a very powerful, strong scene.
Yeah, because I'd never seen. I mean, I can't confess to have seen all of Pierce's films, but I'd never seen him go that way before.
No, I mean, it's pretty good. Have you ever seen the Taylor of Panama?
It's on my list of films to watch, and I think Cam has seen it. Yeah.
You won't be disappointed. It's one of John Bourne's better films. I mean, it's not better films as though he's not good. He's great filmmaking. It's a good film.
But yeah, it definitely surprised me seeing Pierce going that way, and I think the scene really works well. So that's a great choice. There was a moment I wanted to pick your brain about, and that is also a connection to Dante's Peak, which is your other Pierce Brosnan film in that sense. At the start of the film of Dante's Peak, there's his love interest, I believe, or fiance, gets struck by a bit of the crater, like falling through the car.
Yeah.
And then in The November Man, Pierce Brosnan's love interest is shot whilst driving with him in a car. Was that like an intentional nod, or was that just scripting that was just serendipitous?
You're the first person, and myself included, that's even seen the connection between the two. I personally had never thought about that, and I guess in terms of storytelling, if you put the character under a sort of a stress, you answer the questions of why are you romantically available. You're wounded, you're a little bit wounded, and so you're vulnerable. You've got some sympathy from the audience because you've had this tragic event in your life, and all you need is a good woman to sort of bring you out of your depression. So it ticks all those boxes.
No, it absolutely works, and it's one we're looking forward to tackling on the show down the road. But it was great to see Pierce Brosnan back in the role as a spy again, and I think it was very well done.
No, good. Well, thank you very much.
Well, I mean, you've done 3 spy films that all have a very strong sense of identity. Is that something you would look at doing again, or do you feel like, other projects you don't want to do that again?
Well, no, I love spy films, because they tick a lot of boxes in terms of what you're trying to do. Trying to keep the audience interested. You've got a lot to drive it, and it's where a lot of spy films fall short. They get too complicated, and you lose interest in them. And for me, the challenge of making it, keeping the audience interested, is what makes the fun of doing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Calling all agents. Independent podcasting, much like the spy game, requires considerable resources. Whether it's research, equipment, hosting, or of course constructing a top secret volcano lair, we're putting out the call for your support.
That's right. As you may know, we've activated the Spy Hearts Patreon, home of our ever-growing lineup of Agents in the Field episodes where we decode non-spy films from your favorite spy actors and full film commentaries with more intel than a Basil exposition briefing.
Cam, what have we got in our crosshairs this month?
Yes, we are tackling the 2001 video game adaptation Lara Croft Tomb Raider with Angelina Jolie and Daniel Craig. Make sure to hit start on this one, folks.
And if that sounds delicious, then become a true spy hard today and join the circus at patreon.com/spyhards. But before this message self-destructs, Cam, resume the spy jinx.
Just one other project I just want to touch on briefly was the movie Species,
which
was, that was an incredibly fun movie. I remember seeing that, as a teenager, and it's one that I think a lot of maybe critics weren't the kindest to, but has had a bit of a reputation as a very notable cult film of the decade that it came out. And I would like to know, just when you're essentially taking kind of like a B-movie premise and elevating it, what drew you to the project, I suppose, first of all?
My agent at CAA took over running MGM. And if I'm really honest, that's how I came to be involved in it.
Right.
Marcus said, "Hey, Rog, I've got this great show that I think you'd be perfect for." And I was like, "Oh, horror movie." He says, "Yeah, but you'll be able to get a great cast and we'll make a fantastic movie and we'll be right behind you. Come on, do this film for me." And he was right. We managed to get a really A cast, with Ken, with just the people that got involved, Mike Madsen and Mark Helgenberger and Ben Kingsley, and we managed to get some. We just put such a good cast together. I just felt like that we were going to make an entertaining film here. And Natasha Henstridge, of course, gets an enormous pat on the back because she was this young 19-year-old actress who'd never been in a film before. That taking your clothes off for now is a completely thankless task, but even then it wasn't a thing. A lot of people, hard to take, people, actors seriously if they're prepared to be naked, and she was, and she did a fantastic job, and people still love her work.
Yeah, like that became an iconic performance within, the genre. And
of course, getting H.R. Giger involved, he gave it another sort of depth. His association with Alien.
Yeah, the H.R. Giger design was it became definitely iconic as well. What goes into creating like a kind of a monster design that's going to last? Because that one has.
No, I think Frank Mancuso Jr. Everybody wanted. I don't remember how Giger became involved, but everybody thought it was a great idea as he'd done such sort of crazy stuff for Alien that was so successful, and his own personal interest was sort of this sort of hyper sort of monster alien sort of sexy sort of stuff. He was the perfect person to do the models. I remember going to his house in Switzerland, and it was like, oh my God. I've got a video somewhere that I shot of him showing me around his house. It's pretty amazing.
It feels like it could be a nightmare factory, that house, I have to say. Like, very unsettling, I imagine.
No, it was more than unsettling.
Did the designs vary wildly before you settled on the finished Sill design, or was it?
Well, the challenge, of course, was how to do it, because it was the early days of. One of the reasons that I was interested in doing the film was because it was the early days of motion capture, and I imagined that we were going to do quite a bit of motion capture work to make this character. But the truth was, once we tried to make the monster stick to the hard surfaces, it became very tricky, and I was less than convinced. And so I resorted to, everything's got to be done for real, because the digital work's just not going to probably be good enough. So there's stuff like when where the monster's got the guy in the hot tub, and it's the actor with this monster glued to his back, thrashing around as though the monster's trying to drown him, but in fact it's him he's motivating the monster because the monster's attached to him, and then running some of the action backwards and just to make it look weird and odd, and just coming up with old-fashioned movie tricks to make stuff look convincing.
Now, there was a sequel to Species. Did you ever consider?
There's been somebody said there's been 6. I've never seen one of them, but never offered me one of them. They still claim that Species has not broken even yet.
Yeah, like Species 2 was like theatrical, and the rest all went straight to video. But were you ever approached about directing Species 2?
I had nothing to do with anything.
No.
It sounds like you're probably best not to be involved, judging by Cam's reaction there.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
You made the wise call.
Yeah. We'll start to sort of wrap up on the questions, but one thing looking at your filmography, I'm sort of struck by is the variety of the films that you've tackled, from science fiction to spy films, which is why we're here. What is it that interests you in telling these sorts of stories and changing from sort of different genres all the time? Because is it about keeping it fresh? What's the thing that keeps it going for you?
Well, if I look at what I've got in sort of personal development right now, I've got and now streaming TV is sort of where the future lies. There's not sort of films that I've been making, theatricals less interested in them than streaming options. I've got to think about a pre-war race car driver called Richard Seaman who drove for Mercedes, and it's a sort of pre-war rise of fascism against the sort of ambiguity of if you're he was English, and he drove for Mercedes, so right up until 1938. So it's a sort of pre-war thriller, drama, political story. I've got I guess it's sort of a comedy about genetic testing. Identifying who you are through your genetic DNA. Another one that's sort of set in Venice, just a multi-layered story, sort of like Crash, or one of those sort of stories that stories intersecting other stories. Writing is thrilled in the outback of Australia.
But even from those three that you've got coming up, again, a variety of sort of genres there. If you had to sort of maybe pick, is there a favorite you like doing when it comes to directing, a type of story you love telling?
No, I just love working.
That's fair. That's fair. Well, then, I suppose one question we like to ask, especially when we have directors and writers on the show, is there a film of things that you've made that maybe isn't like the most known, so it's not the Dante's Peak, it's not the Species, but one that you're really proud of that you could say, hey, check out if you want to see something else that you'd enjoy?
Well, the one that got me to Hollywood was a movie called Smash Palace, and because it was a small art house film in Europe, all over the world, it's really only known by sort of film aficionados, and I think that still stands up quite well. Smash Palace. They made that in 1981.
Okay.
And The World's Fastest Indian, which is another project that I did, people assume because it's about motorbikes that it's not for them, but it's less about motorbikes and more about just what does one do with one's life.
Okay. Two excellent choices there. Great.
There was a film called Marie that sort of came and went because of the studio had changed, called Marie with Sissy Spacek and Morgan Freeman, that I think stands up well.
Well, there you go. A smorgasbord of films to check out. There you go. Perfect.
Yeah.
Again, totally different.
Yeah.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this question. You've got your 3 spy films, okay, and you've got 3 leads. If you put them in a fight, who's winning? Is it Kevin Costner, is it Pierce Brosnan, or is it Colin Farrell?
I think they all give each other a bit of a thump.
That's the political answer right there, and I love it. But of those 3, obviously you watched No Way Out again today. Is there a particular favorite, one that you hold near and dear?
Well, no, I mean, all of those guys are very strong, talented actors that have done fantastic work in their lives. I watched Colin Farrell in something in Bruges. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Good film.
Oh, yeah.
Fantastic in that film.
He's incredible.
Pierce, I just happened to watch the Tower of Panama the other day again. He's great in that film. Kevin's always good.
Could you pick one of your spy films as a particular favorite?
They're all, the process of doing them all was so different. They're hard to compare. I mean, obviously, No Way Out meant a lot to me because it was just arrived in Hollywood, and it was the first time I'd done a thriller, and so it was good to come out on top on that show.
Yeah, well, it's probably the one I would tend to lean towards. If one thing that we didn't ask you with the No Way Out at the top though, it's probably best that you bring it up now. What's your favorite moment from that film?
No Way Out. I've just watched it.
Now you're on the spot.
I think the stuff with George Zanza. George Zanza, the guy in the wheelchair.
He's great.
He's great.
Absolutely fantastic.
I love the interaction between those two. And George was such a lovely, fine. You really did believe that he lived in that wheelchair. You feel bad when he gets killed in the gymnasium. So that sequence there where, Kevin's confessing to George that, he's the guy they're looking for. I mean, I felt that was strong. And then there's some great scenes, some of the stuff between him and of course, between him and Sean Young is really great.
No, for sure.
I like the opening actually when they're sort of, sizing each other up at the inaugural party.
Yeah, and I have to really compliment you on staging that party sequence, because you introduce all of your major characters for the most part in that party sequence, and it really is effective.
Yeah.
Well, final question to ask you then. This has been asked to everyone from John Glenn to Rawson Marshall Thurber. The question we have to ask, because we talk about spy movies every week, what is your favorite spy movie, Roger?
And you're not allowed to pick your own, of course.
Some have, to be fair, which I think is a bit cheeky, but I understand why they do it.
No, I can't do that. I'm trying to think. I think it's called The 39 Steps.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Hitchcock one.
Yeah, I remember that, loving that film.
Is that the Hitchcock one, or is that the one from the 50s?
God,
It's in black and white.
it's in black and white.
Yeah, the Hitchcock
Yeah.
one.
That's a terrific film. Excellent choice. And we briefly mentioned James Bond. Obviously, you've worked with Pierce a couple of times. Are you a fan of the Bond films?
I am. I mean, I sort of regretted that I didn't get a chance to do a Bond film. My dad was he loved James Bond. I mean, he just, if I could have told my dad I was doing a James Bond film, he'd still be alive.
It's a shame you can't recall when about that conversation took place, because I think me and Cam would try and figure out now which film you might have directed. We'll try and piece that together. But is any particular James Bond films favorites for you?
Well, I was a big fan of Pierce, maybe just because I know Pierce well, and I think he was, Pierce was probably my favorite because he has that, Daniel Craig just didn't quite seem to have the same suave sort of quality about him that Pierce has. I thought Pierce was fantastic in James Bond.
Yeah, no argument.
You'll get no argument. Yep. No. He's the reason.
But every one of them, Sean Connery, I mean, they all created such strong, everyone took over the character and it became them.
No, for sure. I mean, I would have wanted more Pierce Brosnan films if I could have had it, but that's how history turned out. Well, I think all that's left to say, Roger, is firstly thank you for the Roger Donaldson trilogy of spy films that we have now. They're not very well connected to each other, but I in my head I can connect them.
Because there are movies like 13 Days that sort of, it's not exactly a spy film, but it's in the world of sort of international politics and trying to keep track of what's going on internationally.
Yeah, definitely.
So I wouldn't call it a spy film. I sort of put it in that sort of camp of politics and international Machiavellian goings on.
Well, they can be connected, those films. Maybe we'll have to have a little dive into it and see what we can find. But is there potentially one day a fourth spy film, making it a quadrilogy of Roger Donaldson films?
There's always a possibility.
Well, I think it's a beautiful note to.
Actually, I have one that I'm in the middle of writing called Mole Hunter. So I guess that's going to be a spy film.
There you go. Who can we cast from your previous films in it? I want a connective tissue, so I can link it together. But that's a beautiful way to end the chat. I think, Roger, I want to thank you for taking the time for breaking down your spy films with us. We've enjoyed watching them and talking about them over the last few years, and it's great to finally speak to you about your contributions to spy films. So, Roger Donaldson, thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much, guys. Much appreciated your interest and great to talk to you.
And we're back from our chat with Mr. Roger Donaldson. I want to thank him once again for taking the time to speak to us for just short of an hour about not only this week's film, The Recruit, but No Way Out, November Man, and many other hit films that I'm sure you're all familiar with. But Cam, how was that for you?
Well, Scott, this was actually really exciting because we've talked to a lot of writers, a lot of directors, but can you think of many times we've talked to someone who has made two movies we've covered on the show? Like, usually we're looking for insight into something like, The Avengers you referenced earlier or something. But this was a case where Roger Donaldson has directed two movies that we've covered on the show. So just from like No Way Out going into The Recruit, I had a lot of questions that those movies raised that I was happy he was able to give some insight on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting as well and this is not by choice, but we're actually going through his filmography in like a chronology sense. We've done No Way Out. About a year later, we did The Recruit. I guess in about a year's time, we're going to tackle The November Man.
That would seem to be the trend, yes.
Yeah.
Are we going to... Oh, we have to tackle it in November, right?
Oh, you have to, don't you? Yeah, that makes perfect... Well, okay, 2023 November, mark your calendars, folks. The November Man returns. But yeah, as we mentioned, Jeremiah Chechik is a good starting off point. But yeah, we've spoken to like John Glenn, who's done 5 Bond films. So yes, there is that. But these spy films are all very different.
Yeah, well, that's a good point about John Glenn, but that's within like kind of one body of work, whereas with Donaldson, it's like 2 very different spy vehicles, completely different stars, working with different studios. So like in terms of just like having 2 projects that are kind of for us interest points is a rarity, and I was really excited to have him on to talk about them.
Well, yeah, and I think one thing that Roger was clearly proud of is the fact that he got to work with some of these actors that were literally just breaking out at the time. You look at Kevin Costner in No Way Out. I mean, Pierce Brosnan had already done like Remington Steele, Mrs. Doubtfire, and Dante's Peak. But you look at, say, Colin Farrell, which is really that his rise was in the early noughties. And he's working up against Al Pacino. And I'd never drawn that distinction that he did actually about, Al Pacino and Colin Farrell up against, Kevin Costner and Gene Hackman as this like veteran actor against, not really a newbie, but someone who's really breaking out. I'd never really tied those 2 things together, which I think was quite a nice sort of through line through his career in spy movies. But I think overall, the thing I found fascinating was he was just wandering from film to film, really. He was looking for a different challenge every time and just sort of wandered into the territory of another spy film. But there is a gap of 16 years between those 2 films.
It's interesting that he's drawn to these kind of spy projects that are very twist-based. A lot of like elements that are kind of piling up, but also like a kind of real-world, almost procedural element to the storytelling. And that, obviously No Way Out is really giving you this inside baseball look at sort of intelligence through the Kevin Costner character. And The Recruit is doing that as well with Colin Farrell entering into CIA training and then ultimately kind of a CIA operation or question mark. So I think it's really interesting that like these types of stories draw him in. And I haven't seen The November Man yet. You have, Scott, but does that tie closely to that one as well?
It does. And the other through line I think that sort of holds up through all of them, and also kind of Dante's Peak as well, is there's definitely a sense of like impending doom that really ties them all together. I don't know if you could say it happens to necessarily in Cocktail, but looking at some of Roger's films, especially the spy ones, and November Man is one that stands out to me as well, is it really feels like the walls are closing in on everyone towards the end of the film.
Definitely.
And it manages to sort of do that without feeling too heavy on the viewer. And much like, weaving all those spy plots together, it's not also too confusing for the viewer. Something like A Funeral in Berlin I would always go back to as a touchstone for that. And so I think it's credit to him for being able to balance keeping that thriller mystery aspect going throughout, but at the same time making it approachable. Because these are meant as mainstream films. These aren't, pitched as direct-to-streaming films that are only for a small audience.
Well, that was something about both No Way Out and The Recruit that jumped out at me, was these movies are very complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. There are shifting loyalties among the characters. And somehow he makes this all very digestible for a mainstream audience. It's a sort of thing that could easily be too complicated, or with, a rewrite and a different vision would be something maybe more like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy type of storytelling, where it's for a specific audience, but it's not necessarily going to draw in, 4,000 theaters worth of people on an opening weekend. Like the movies he makes are very much big screen mainstream entertainments that still deliver those sorts of spy thrills.
Yeah, which that's not something everyone can do. That takes a certain skill to take something that could be seen as quite intricate, quite cold, quite unapproachable, and making it so a general audience. So, because the way I always look at films, especially spy films in my head when I'm doing like writing my reviews, is what would my mum think of this film?
Right.
And if she's confused, then the average audience goer is confused. Because she's not great at paying attention, but she'll pay attention to a film. But if it gets too much, she'll just detach. And I can't say about any of, The Recruit, November Man, or No Way Out, that they are so up their own butts that they push the viewer away.
No, and you really understand that No Way Out is a mainstream popular movie when you see it being spoofed in Hot Shots Part 2. In the limo, love scene, is basically brought over to Hot Shots, the second movie, and pretty much replicated and then completely spoofed. That doesn't happen if it's a little more art house or a little more cerebral. It's very clear that when the makers of Hot Shots were looking at movies for inspiration, that's a mainstream. No Way Out was a mainstream movie that they could draw on. And, I revisited No Way Out the night before we did the interview, which I think we acknowledged in the interview as well. But I had a great time rewatching this movie. I think this might be one of my favorite sort of mainstream Hollywood spy films that we've covered, especially of this era. I think of the 80s stuff, it's near the top for me.
It's also just a bit of a sleeper film. Like it's if people talk about underrated films, which is a very overused word, but underrated films, in terms of the spy world, No Way Out is definitely up on that list.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
And just a couple of things I wanted to touch on with Roger's connection with Pierce. I didn't know they were friends prior to Dante's Peak. I always assumed they met filming that and then eventually worked together again on The November Man. But nice to know they were friends before. It sounds like they had a really great time working on that film. I mean, Roger got very impassioned talking about that going head to head with Volcano, which I think is a fascinating story in Hollywood anyway, because you'd think most of the time a film studio finds out the other film studio is doing a film just like theirs, and they'll either try and change it or they'll bump it to some other time.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, that happens every now and again. We had the dueling Comet movies in Deep Impact and Armageddon in 98. Or there was the 2 Snow White movies in Snow White and the Huntsman and Mirror Mirror that came out, a handful of years ago. It's one of these things that definitely happens. And I will say that, Dante's Peak and Volcano, I very, very much remember when these 2 movies were coming out. I did see Dante's Peak in theaters. I did not see Volcano in theaters. And this is not blowing smoke at all to say this. Dante's Peak is way better than Volcano.
Was that a pun?
You know what? It wasn't in conception, but I'm going to stand that yes, it was a pun that I intended this entire time because it's brilliant. But no, I'm not just saying that because we interviewed the director of the film. Genuinely, Dante's Peak is the better Volcano film and probably the best volcano disaster movie to date. I don't think we have that many, so I think that's a pretty easy call.
Yeah, I don't want to go on about Dante's Peak too much, but, it was interesting because I definitely watched it on home video in the 90s, probably a rental with the family. I wouldn't have been old enough to see it in theaters. I remember bits and bobs from it, but from rewatching it the other day before this interview, I was struck by just a sense of I don't want to say violence, because it's not a violent film, but it is brutal
or intense
in its execution. Intense, yeah, like seeing the grandmother boiling alive in the lake that's turning to acid. I'd forgotten that happened.
I'll never forget that happened.
Nor will I now. That the shrieks that she's making in that lake as she's being dragged out, piercing, if you'll pardon that pun.
Oh, wow.
And speaking of piercing, we also spoke about The November Man as well. So it's interesting that we're speaking about a film we haven't covered yet. So that's why only I watched it and you're remaining sort of fresh to the film for when we cover it in November. But yeah, continuing his adventures with Pierce Brosnan, Pierce coming back to the role of a spy after, Bond and a couple of other films as well. And it seems like I would have got the idea that there was some reservations on Pierce's part, but it seems like from Roger that he was very gung-ho just to do it. He had a story he wanted to tell because obviously his company had bought the rights to the story of The November Man from the book it was based off of. So it's just nice to hear that Pierce was happy to go back into it. And it's interesting now, at the time of recording, and a little bit of inside baseball here, this was recorded in 2022, and we're walking around seeing posters of Black Adam everywhere, and Pierce Brosnan's face is plastered over them. He's obviously a key part of the film. I'm not sure I'll go and see it, but even now, Pierce Brosnan's still a leading man, so one can hope he might have one last spy movie in him.
Oh, I don't think it's out of the question. I think it could easily happen because Pierce Brosnan seems to understand what at least an element of his appeal is. Because, you go back to Remington Steele and then Bond. He gets that people like seeing him play these sorts of characters. And he also seems like someone who, as he gets older, is interested in exploring the darker aspects of that life. I haven't seen November Man, but Taylor of Panama very much delved into. And I could see, like a 60s or 70s Brosnan deciding that he wants to do a spy film about the end of a spy's career. I could see that for sure.
And I'd totally turn up for that too. And you talk about the darkness of the character. That's definitely in November Man, in a scene that I spoke about with Roger, that I'm sure those who have seen the film will know exactly the scene we were talking about. And obviously, I thought that would be quite the challenge for him. I haven't seen The Tailor of Panama, so I can't compare and contrast. But I'd never seen that side of Brosnan before, so it was nice to talk to Roger about sort of coaching him and directing him through that. Obviously, Pierce was going through some personal issues at the time, as well as making this film. But I'm a big fan of November Man, so I'm glad I got to speak to Roger about it. But Cam, do you have any final notes on that you want to discuss?
Yeah, it was just fun to talk to him about Species, a movie that was a big hit with my friends and I back in the 90s, and I've seen it since, and it does hold up as like one of those really memorable kind of sci-fi B movies of the time. And Natasha Henstridge became like an icon out of that movie, and it was interesting to hear him talk about, not just her, but the entire cast of that movie, which when you look at that cast now, it's pretty unbelievable. And while he's a director who typically worked with a lot of big movie stars on his films, whether it was Kevin Costner or Tom Cruise, Brosnan, it was interesting to see him work with more of a ensemble of character actors on Species, and I think it really worked. And also just the vision of him going to H.R. Geiger's house was incredible. Yeah,
apparently it's worse than a nightmare in there. That was the line. So I don't want to see inside that house. Now, I've never seen Species, but your impassioned discussion with Roger is pushing me to do so.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fun movie for sure. Yeah, but don't watch Species 2.
That's not Roger approved, as we learnt from the discussion.
That's right.
But there you go, folks. That was our chat with Roger himself. I hope you gleaned some information about either The Recruit, No Way Out, November Man, Dante's Peak, or any other number of films that we discussed in the interview. And again, I want to thank him for taking the time to join us. It's not often you get to speak to the people that help make the films you love growing up. So that's always nice to do. Cam, the question goes to you, sir. What are we doing next week?
Yes, we are going to be celebrating Valentine's Day. We've never really done this in the past over the last couple of years of the podcast, but we have some, I think, holiday-appropriate programming. We are going to look at 2018's The Spy Who Dumped Me, starring Mila Kunis and Kate McKinnon.
That's right, folks. Snuggle huggle up for this one. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to check out The Spy Who Dumped Me and join us next week. If you like what you heard on the show, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. And do not forget to follow us discreetly on social media at SpyHards, that's SpyHards, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners, just be thankful you're not spending the evening at H.R. Geiger's house.